Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Remco Tanis, and on behalf of Asia Society Switzerland, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the final Oxford-style debate of 2022. The question we will address today is, has China's global power reached its peak? And we come to you on the day that China announced its former leader Jiang Zemin died today in Shanghai at age 96. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the final Communist Party's highest position in the aftermath of the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown, which put China in diplomatic isolation. Jiang was able to bring back the country on the world stage in the years following and oversaw an unprecedented economic boom. Now, on the day of Jiang's demise, we debate whether the country has seen the best of that growth, or is there, despite all current problems we're seeing, more to expect from Beijing in the near future? To begin, let me quickly lay out the structure of today's debate. First, in a few moments, you will get to vote on whether you agree or disagree with today's motion. We will then hear from our two teams, one arguing in favor of the motion, the other against. Over the course of the debate, both teams will try to convince you of their respective views. And to do that, each team will kick off with a 4-minute opening statement. These are followed by a 4-minute rebuttal from the opposing team. Then we'll spend about 20 to 25 minutes discussing the motion. This is also the time for Q&A, for which we welcome your questions. You can ask them via the Q&A function on Zoom, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Finally, each debater will have 2 minutes for closing arguments, their final chance to get you to join their camp. After that, you, the audience, get to vote a second time on whether you agree or disagree with the motion, this time armed with the added knowledge and arguments from our debaters. The team that has gained the most support in this second vote compared to the first vote will be declared the winner of today's debate. As I mentioned, today's motion is China's global power has reached its peak. We will open the initial vote now. You will see the options on your screen. Vote yes if you agree with the motion, so you think that China's global power has indeed reached its peak. Vote no if you think that is not the case. If you don't know yet, you guessed it, vote I don't know. Okay, while you vote, let me briefly set out what we're debating today. For the first time in more than 3 decades, China's economic growth will fall behind the rest of Asia. President Xi Jinping's zero COVID strategy has pushed down everything from manufacturing to mobility and consumption in the world's second largest economy. The worsening ties between China and the United States are furthermore putting pressure on China's international trade. At the same time, Xi secured a norm-breaking third term as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, cementing his political power. His demands for unity, a strengthening of domestic supply chains, and for the country to be prepared for dangers in peacetime shows Xi's determination for China to keep its position as a preeminent global power. Yet over the past few days and weeks, we've witnessed protests against the never-ending cycle of repeated lockdowns and never-ending slog of PCR testing. The unrest is rare in how widespread it is throughout the country and throughout different layers of society. And it might chip away at Xi's myth of infallibility. Will Xi's ambitions, which he laid out last month at the 20th Party Congress, make China stronger, or will his tight grip stir up more international and domestic resentment? How are China's economic problems affecting its influence in Asia? Will the country decouple from the global market? Will it be able to keep and grow its position as a world power? Or have we already witnessed the peak of China's global power? These questions are at the core of today's debate. We will close the polls now, and thank you very much for your votes. Okay, let me now introduce you to our debate teams. First, arguing for the motion, we have Simona Grano. Simona is a senior lecturer at the University of Zurich, where she is also the director of the Taiwan Studies Project. She completed her PhD in Chinese studies at Ca' Foscari University in Venice, Italy in 2008. Since then, Simona has held research positions and taught China studies and Taiwan studies at her alma mater at the University of Zurich as well, here in Switzerland, and at National Chengchi University in Taiwan. Her latest edited volume, China-US Competition, Impact on Small and Middle Power Strategic Choices, will be published soon by Palgrave Macmillan. Joining Simona to argue in favor of the motion is Daniel H. Rosen, coming to us from New York. Dan is co-founder of Rhodium Group, an independent economic research partnership where he leads the firm's work on China. Dan has worked professionally on China's domestic economy and global commercial relations since 1992, so for 30 years now. And he's widely recognized for his research on US-China relations and Asian commercial dynamics. Dan is affiliated with numerous think tanks focused on international economics and is an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University in New York. On the other side, we have the team arguing against the motion today, which is uniquely made up entirely of experts from the Asia Society Policy Institute. First, we have Rorry Daniels, who is the managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, also based in New York. She leads and oversees strategy and operations for the Institute's projects on security, climate change, and trade throughout Asia. And she's also a senior fellow with the Institute's recently opened Center for China Analysis. Rorry was previously with the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, where she managed the organization's research portfolio on Asia security issues. And finally, joining Rorry arguing against the motion is Gill, the executive director of the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Bates leads a team of research fellows, associated researchers, and administrative staff to deliver on the center's aim to be a global leader for policy-relevant, objective analysis of China's politics, economy, and society, and of the country's impact on Asia and the rest of the world. Prior to joining Asia Society, Bates held a number of research and academic leadership positions in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the United States. And today, Bates is joining us from tomorrow, as he is in Sydney, Australia, where it is a bit after 4 o'clock early Thursday morning. So thank you very much, and thank you all very much for being with us here today. Let's dive straight in with the first opening statement coming from Simona Grano, arguing in favor of the motion. Simona, you have 4 minutes.
Right. So let me start with a statement. Global power is the expectation that a nation has actually an accelerating capacity to compel others and achieve its own interests. And in this regard, we can definitely say that China's power has peaked. Expectations for China's power are decelerating for profound political and economic reasons we're now going to look into. So in November 2021, the CCP Central Committee argued that China was faced with unprecedented external risks and challenges. In the same year, the Communist Party released its new National Security Strategy 21-25. Now, shortly after, China legislatures actually passed a raft of national security legislation on topics ranging from criminal procedure to border security, regulation of NGOs, data security, counterterrorism, cybersecurity, food safety, and other threats. One can actually draw a direct line from these threats to each of Xi Jinping's signature initiatives, his anti-corruption campaign, his efforts to strengthen patriotic education, ideological indoctrination, and of course, the party's penetration of society, as well as his push to assert party control over the military and of course, other domestic security apparatuses. These are not the premises of a healthy country focusing on its global power or on relaunching its sluggish economy. We have also seen a further enhancement of security threats against which the party needs to be vigilant during Xi Jinping's speech at the 20th Party Congress. And the CCP is deeply worried about possible challenges to its political role. But let me now briefly address all the sources of advantages that China enjoyed and that are now gradually eroding. So if we look back to the early times of the reform era and all the way up to the 2000s, actually China was nearly self-sufficient in food production, water, and energy. It enjoyed at the same time the largest demographic dividend in history, with 10 working age adults for every senior citizen aged 65 or older. China had a secure geopolitical environment, easy access to foreign markets and technology, all of this invigorated by friendly relationship with the United States. And at the same time, China's government was actually skillfully able to capitalize on these advantages by undertaking, of course, a process of economic reform and opening. So we can say that from the 1980s to 2010, more or less, China really had the right mix of environmental conditions, people, and politics to thrive. However, since the late 2000s, all the drivers of China's rise have either stalled or completely inverted. For example, China is running out of resources. Water has become scarce, and the country imports more energy and food than any other nation on earth. China is also facing a demographic tipping point. Between 2020 and 2050, the country will lose a staggering 200 million working age adults and gain 200 million older people. The fiscal and economic consequences of this will be devastating, with more expenditures going forward concerning both social security and medical care. And to make matters worse, China is actually turning away from the policies that encouraged rapid growth in the past. Under Xi Jinping, China is sliding back towards totalitarianism. The economic loss caused by these trends is actually intensifying the slowdown that would have occurred anyway as a fast-growing economy ages. The Chinese economy, we know, has been losing momentum for more than a decade now, and its official growth rate has actually fallen from 14% in 2007 to 6% in 2019, and studies currently suggest that the actual growth rate is close to 2.5%. Worst of all is, of course, the fact that most of the growth has come from governmental stimulus programs. So there are four main problems that will likely prevent the PRC from sustaining rising global power: debt, demographics, water scarcity, and lack of a sufficiently educated population to join the ranks of rich and developed countries. As Scott Rosell teaches us, no country with less than 60% of its population having completed secondary education has succeeded, and the average percentage for the PRC is 37%. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Simona. Now for the opening statement of the team arguing against the motion. Bates, you have 4 minutes as well.
Let me first thank everyone at the Asia Society of Switzerland for this opportunity to speak before such an esteemed audience and alongside such accomplished colleagues and good friends. Here's my statement. By any objective, analytical, and numerical measurement of global power, it is clear that China has not peaked and will not anytime soon. Here are my reasons. First, we have to recall that power is a relative concept. Whether China is rising or falling can only be answered accurately by also asking, in comparison to what? For example, we know that relative to the United States and most others in the international system, China's comprehensive national power across economic, technological, military, and other metrics is rising, not declining. Yes, we know that the pace of China's relative gains has slowed in recent years in some respects, but they are gains nonetheless, and the gains continue, therefore they have not peaked. Second, the basic facts also tell us that across economic, technological, military, and political metrics, China's global power continues to grow and has not peaked. Let's take technology. China overtook the United States in 2019 in the number of patent applications worldwide and has world-leading access to data, a commodity critical for the advancement of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. China will also continue to expand its lead in green technology as the largest producer of wind energy and taking the lead in the development, use, and export of other green and low carbon energy technologies such as lithium-ion batteries and solar photovoltaics. China will also continue to lead in the development and export of other important technologies of the future, such as high-speed rail and electric vehicles. China's power to shape the global market in these and other technologies is still growing, not shrinking. It's also a fact that China has maintained strong positive perceptions throughout much of the developing world. China retains solid majority positive perceptions across Africa and amongst many of its Asian neighbors, such as Singapore, Pakistan, Thailand, Cambodia, and others. In the latest Afrobarometer polling completed in 2021, 63% of Africans across 34 countries said that the economic and political influence of China in their country is either somewhat or very positive. These are hardly the polling numbers of a country that has peaked. To take another example of China's growing global power, the country's military capabilities are far from peaking, either quantitatively or qualitatively, actually quite the opposite. And here's just two examples. China now has the world's largest Navy with some 355 ships to America's 295, and that gap is widening, not shrinking. The growth in China's nuclear weapons arsenal has been even more dramatic, with China surpassing France to become the world's third largest nuclear weapons power in 2021, and on a pace to triple its intercontinental range nuclear missile force in the next several years, thereby expanding, not diminishing, its global power and reach. According to the 2022 US National Security Strategy, China is, quote, investing in a military that is rapidly modernizing and growing in strength and reach globally, unquote. Believing that China has reached peak power is not only wrong, but can be analytically dangerous, and sometimes seems to be based more on hope than on sharp analysis and basic facts. Will China's power peak someday? Of course it will, just as other powers over the centuries have peaked and fallen. But to address the question we are debating this evening, has China's global power reached its peak today? The answer is clearly no, not yet.
Thank you very much, Bates. We'll move right on with the first rebuttal, where a team can respond to the arguments from the other side. And for the first rebuttal, we go to Dan. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. So great to be part of this terrific gathering. Let me start by saying it's probably for the best that the evidence on the relative strength of the West, which Bates described, actually points the other way. As market democracies do, we are adjusting. We're learning from mistakes, getting back to our growth potential, which we seem to agree here is the wellspring of power, getting past COVID, back to growth, investing in technology in a massive and exciting new way, and emphasizing cooperation among the advanced market democracies. I have much less joy to observe that our opponent's outlook for China, for example, Dr. Gill's suggestion that the gains continue, as Bates says, is faulty, in fact. We all want a stronger China in some ways, a China that can shoulder greater global burdens. We want its potential to grow its markets so that we can sell into them. And we want an innovative China that starts contributing to net global technological capabilities rather than coercing technology away from others. But the arguments we've been offered for that happening here are deeply flawed. That China can lead in exporting green technology at a time when in Europe we're talking about carbon border adjustment mechanisms designed to offset China's unfair trading behaviors. The surveys that have been mentioned showing a positive views of China in Africa are only some surveys. There are many others that suggest the other way. And China's focus on building up its weapon stocks, this is a 19th century definition of power. It's not a definition of power fit for the 21st century. Let's look closer at the actual economic wellsprings of China's power and the reasons why its foundations are cracking today. In the real world, beyond political slogans, there are 4 components of economic power growth. First is business investment, which has accounted for almost half of China's economy the past 20 years. Foremost within investment, it's property, then heavy industry and infrastructure. All of these are suffering from rampant overinvestment, crushing debt loads, and are either starting to default actively right now or headed toward that fate. Even parts of the more promising high-tech space in the economy are overcapacity and cannot maintain the debt-driven investment model they're using today. Second is household consumption. Here too, debt has been a rising part of the story of Chinese household consumption growth. And lately, in addition, unemployment, previously unseen at the levels we're learning about today in China's cities, is taking the wind out of the economic sails. Even before we turn to look at the cold blanket of bungled zero COVID policies that's diminished China's growth. Third, government spending today cannot come to the rescue because it's dependent on selling land to property developers, which, as we just noted, is already in default. And finally, exports. China's ability to assume, as Simona noted, that it could just keep exporting forever is absolutely at its limit. The world is starting to push back on that. With the right policies, China could rekindle the fires of sustainable growth. But as Simona explained, the political tools and social underpinnings needed to implement those policies are missing. Green growth, common prosperity, zero COVID, these are great expectations, but they're simply not possible with the singular focus on struggle, struggle, struggle against everybody and everything that Beijing is trumpeting today. We need to get very real about that urgently because that's the reality we're dealing with.
Thank you very much, Dan. And now for the final rebuttal, we go to Rorry. You have also 4 minutes.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all of my colleagues for their compelling points. I think that the side arguing that China's power has peaked has made a compelling case that China faces a lot of economic and political headwinds, and that it's deeply unpopular. Its system of governance is deeply unpopular among market economies. But I ask, is that actually a measure of its power? And does that evidence actually suggest that China's power has peaked? China has put itself in a really important and critical, pivotal position in the global economy, where it is the largest trading partner of many of the major world economies, including the US, the EU, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, ASEAN, Taiwan, just to name a few. It is in between the developing and the developed world, importing from one and exporting to another, but it is increasingly becoming the top import destination for many of these large economies. So the idea that it is going to export forever and that is the only way that China can achieve economic growth is, I think, flawed. China also has the ability to tap into its own domestic consumption to import from some of these more advanced economies. It's very integrated inside the global economy, and that also means that pain felt in the Chinese economy will reverberate throughout the world. So as a measure of relative power, as China's economy slows, so too will trading economies in the rest of the world. No matter what happens with China's economy, it still plays this pivotal role between East and West, developed and developing countries. And factors of power do not only include economic strength, but also the ability to tip the scales on pivotal moments of global concern. And what China has shown is that when it comes to making difficult decisions between what our opponents have described as rigid ideological and dogmatic standards and much more practical, pragmatic and flexible choices to keep itself integrated into the global economy and the global political system as a whole, China tends to choose the latter. Let's take, for example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Despite a no-limits partnership with Russia announced just before the invasion, China has not financially or materially supported Russia in the face of US and Western sanctions. Rather than choosing the ideological path, which it is politically aligned, it has chosen the much more pragmatic path of its own domestic national interests. All of the problems that have been focused on by the other side are actually areas where China has a considerable amount of room to grow and improve. Not only that, China's state market system has some advantages in directing influence, compelling countries, as Simona has stated, to make choices critical to its own interests. And as long as its domestic interests are integrated into this global fabric, it will continue to want to and pursue the growth of its power. On the whole, China still remains very healthy relationships with the governments of the developing world. The demand signal from the developing world is quite strong in terms of wanting China's model of development and investment and trade. So China may be facing headwinds, but it is flexible and pragmatic. It's often followed the path of taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and then sliding 2 steps forward again. It is very premature to say that China's power has already peaked when it still has substantial room to both grow its total power, but also to use it much more effectively.
Excellent. Thank you all for your excellent input. We're now moving on to the discussion part of this debate that will last about 20-25 minutes. Again, you as the audience can submit your questions to our debaters. Please do so via the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen in Zoom. And the sooner you get your question in, the likelier it is we'll have time to put it in front of our debaters. By the way, if you see a question from someone else which you like a lot, you can upvote it in the Q&A screen on Zoom as well. That makes it stand out for us, and which means an increased chance that we get to address it here. Okay, my first question is for you, Rorry. So yeah, over the last few days, we've seen large-scale protests against the zero-COVID policy in multiple cities in China. These followed protests in, for example, the world's largest iPhone factory. Now, will this domestic unrest affect Xi's power and with that China's global standing? I mean, isn't the fact that the whole world seems able to largely move on from the pandemic except China, and everyone both inside and outside of China seems to know that, isn't that a huge blow to China's global standing and its influence and damaging its reputation?
I think the COVID story is still to be written. There are many blank chapters on China's COVID story that we still have yet to see how things are developing. I would actually argue that the response to the protests that we're likely to see in the coming weeks will actually show what I have previously argued, that China's policies remain flexible, pragmatic, and really focused on economic growth. China has recently announced a push to complete, or at least to vastly increase, vaccination of people in China over 80 years old, and to, I believe they will be in the coming days also increasing the number of ICU units to deal with a limited economic opening that will certainly cause COVID cases inside China to rise, but will be responsive to some of the criticisms that they have faced so far. Significantly, when the central government faces protest, as they do often in China, something that I think the Western media doesn't cover well is that protests are continuously happening inside China almost all the time over various issues related to the local governance, complaints about local governance. So China has done a very good job, I think, at the central government level of using the complaints of local governments and blaming governance on local officials in order to keep demand for the central system very strong while still being responsive to people's needs. I suspect that's what we will see play out in China over the coming weeks and months. And I think that if China can manage to walk this fine line between economic opening and tragic events of COVID deaths, et cetera, they will find that their global standing in the world actually increases rather than decreases.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you, Simona. You argued that China is missing the political and social underpinnings to put right policies in place to rekindle the growth, which is slowing dramatically at the moment. Can you tell me what underpinnings are needed exactly, and are they hindering the all-powerful Xi Jinping to turn to these policies anyways whenever he feels time? I mean, or is he not powerful enough to bypass these missing political and social underpinnings?
I would rather argue that these problems are actually caused by his attitude. I mean, first of all, he's actually facing a lot of challenges, and China with him. Some of these on the domestic front, troubles that we have talked about before on the housing market, skyrocketing youth unemployment. The kind of protests that we're seeing these days are, of course, because of the COVID restrictions and the lockdowns, but they go and increase a sort of dissatisfactions that we see in the younger population generation that for some people really are, it's the first time that they see 18% of youth unemployment and other, of course, dissatisfactions. And I would say, of course, a decrease in overall economic productivity, which also makes people unhappy, right? So I would go back to your question. I would say that it's actually he is responsible for making China go back to a time, or rather to a time that predates the kind of reforms that they launched, and to a time that is really not conducive to relaunching China's global status. On the domestic and political front, I think the situation is not stable. We are seeing this day. And to go back and just briefly say, also comment on what Rorry said, I think very easily they could import Western vaccines, but they don't do that. And this shows us very well that there is always an underlying trumpeting ideological framework that is more important than the flexibility that Rorry was mentioning, in my opinion. And also, I think that the kind of concentration of power in the hands of one man that we're seeing without the collective leadership of the past, no sharing of power, this very bellicose attitude that he has towards the outside world, towards the United States. Yes, we have seen the meeting with Biden, but I think, in my opinion, that's more of a buying of time. All of that really makes us think that there is no quality for the decisions that are resulting out of the consequence of a system where subordinates don't even dare to tell him that it would be in the interest of the population, for example, to do really practical things such as I said before, import Western vaccines.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, Bates, a question for you. China has been flexing its military muscle in the region, especially in this year, especially after Pelosi's visits to Taiwan in, I believe, late August or September. It's been more assertive towards the Philippines in the South China Sea. It's been flying fighter jets close by or in Japanese airspace. How serious do you think is the danger China feels to exert its military power even more if it feels that it's getting increasing pushback from both in the region and outside of the region, or losing influence through other means on the world stage?
Thank you. It is dangerous and it is a great concern. And this is where I would have to take issue with Dan's comment that somehow military power is a 19th century concept. That's naive, Dan. And we have to take seriously what China's doing in terms of its military buildup. Do I like it? Am I happy about it? Absolutely not. But I can tell you that governments and militaries around China's periphery, including the United States and many, many others, take this damn seriously, and China is growing this power exponentially. So in that sense, it is certainly increasing its power and not peaked. Now, what it has to do with regional security, to get to the question, is that it does open up many, many more options for China to exercise its power in ways that it was not previously able to do. I can tell you that planners in the Pentagon take great pause and are increasingly concerned about how China has marshaled this and amassed power in ways that will make any US intervention or intervention by others increasingly more difficult and complex to execute. And this is not just a matter of China's immediate periphery. China will, over the next 10 to 15 years, increase its capability to extend that power even further away from its shores. And so the short answer is, do I think China is going to exercise that power through the use of force to assert its claims? Probably not in the near term, next 5 to 10 years. But could it do so? Does it have greater power to do so? And does it create greater concerns and problems for the rest of us? It certainly does.
Thank you very much. Dan, I have a question for you from the audience, which I'll hook up with a question I had for you as well. Xi Jinping has made it clear in the 20th Party Congress that he prefers the state sector over the private sector in the economy. And the question is, how will this help to propel China ahead of the US, given that innovation is generated in the private sector? And maybe you can also address a bit what it means that China's economic growth is, for the first time in 30 years now, falling behind the rest of Asia.
Falling behind even the United States, I dare say, this year. Look, if your principal objective is economic stability above all things, trying to keep things the way they are, then having a large state sector is a great way to do it, because the state has complete transparency and ability to manage and control the capital outlays, the competitive behavior of those firms. The dynamism and growth and prosperity and innovation that we associate with the advanced market democracies is from the antithesis of that, allowing companies to disrupt incumbents so that we don't just stay at the level of horse and buggy forever, but let a combustion automobile sector crowd them out of business and open up whole new vistas of potential for our economies and our society. And today, new energy vehicle producers are displacing the internal combustion engine, which is crucial if we're ever going to get out of the environmental challenges that we face today. And so this Chinese fetish preoccupation with stability, which I would say, I think Rory's got it right. If China can be pragmatic, it has the potential to get back out of its current rut, back on the kind of trajectory we saw until about 10 years ago. If it is rigid, it will not do so. Its power is locked in where it is. And I think this preoccupation with stability, exemplified by the preference for the state sector, as you note, Remco, tells us all that we need to know in terms of where the future is going and how it's different than the China that we respected and applauded in recent decades.
Thank you very much. Rorry, I want to go back to you for a second. You argued that believing China has reached its peak is based more on hope than on facts. Even though it's facing tough or some headwinds now, it will continue to exert influence. We see disappointment in involved countries over grand international programs like the Belt and Road Initiative. You hear countries having issues paying off their debt to China. You have the 17+1 grouping, which grouped together China with 17 Central and Eastern European countries, which is slowly but certainly shrinking as European countries are turning away from China. Aren't those factual signals of China's influence losing steam?
I would agree that in some ways there are signals of China's influence losing steam, but the question is, how will that develop over time? On Belt and Road Initiative, for example, you'll notice that China has responded, I think, to criticisms of the Belt and Road Initiative, not necessarily by reforming every Belt and Road Initiative program, but by rebranding. First of all, they're now talking about the Global Development Initiative. It's no longer the Belt and Road Initiative, but still offering quite a bit of money to the developing world for infrastructure projects under the Global Development Initiative. They're talking about improving the quality of the Belt and Road Initiative investments as well. So I think China is responsive to some of this criticism, in part because the Belt and Road Initiative projects that they are involved in and that they have done so far help the Chinese economy back home. So again, I would never argue that China is going to be pragmatic and flexible because it has an altruistic view of the world, or because it is, as Dan argued and wants it to be, a responsible global player. It's simply that China's domestic political and economic concerns require it to help other countries trade in, and the way that they can help other countries trade with them is through these infrastructure projects and investments. So the question now becomes, what will countries demand for China to come back to the table? And I think that in that negotiation, you will find that China's flexible and pragmatic style allows them to continue to make inroads and influence, not only to capture the gains that they already have, but also to improve upon those gains over time and therefore grow their power. One final point I would make on debt restructuring is that China has changed its approach in recent years. It's been a active opponent of itself joining the Paris Club, for example, where advanced economies get together to talk about debt issues, but it is increasingly finding ways to help be a part of the management of debt restructuring. For example, it's joined with France, the co-chairing the committee to look at Zimbabwe's debt. So China is trying to find a global leadership role even in debt restructuring. But again, that is because it sees those investments as critical to its own domestic political economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you, Simona. You pointed to the demographic tipping point as a factor that also puts the brakes on China's growth. Sometime in April next year, according to the UN, India will surpass China as the country with the most people on Earth. China's population is shrinking, it's aging. A lot more money is going to have to be spent on medical care, on social security. But a modest economic growth of 2% still brings in an additional $400 billion a year for China. Isn't that plenty to cover those costs? Why is demographics a big enough factor to play a role in China's rise being limited?
I would say it's not just the demographic, as Dan also has explained. I think there's a lot of reactions that could result out of a slowing economy that we are in for the future to see for China. So irritation by the unemployed, we are seeing that these days as well. I believe that mixes up with the rest of the protests. Responses to overreach in people's personal space in the sphere of morality, but also in the sphere of COVID-19, more surveillance in the future, and maybe not, the sentiments of dissatisfaction will reach a critical mass. But anyway, we are seeing forces of social and economic reactions in China that are continue to build up, and of course, add to the problem that you just mentioned of the demographic tipping point. Yeah, so I would say difficulties ahead on at least two fronts for China: the economy slowing, and of course, without any inclination to try and introduce market reform, or at least to go back to the earlier time in order to try and improve the economic prospects going forward. And as we said, of course, these high rates of youth unemployment, poor prospects for university graduates, that all means that competition, for example, for jobs is already very intense, and it will become even more intense in the future. And then, of course, I see problems going forward in the sphere of international relations. So in the international community, which in many respects, contrary to what we have heard, I believe is actually souring its relationship to China. It's true that China is trying to, face up to or better build its allegiances, but we also see in this polarization of situations between the United States and China, they all compete and vie for allegiances of other countries. I don't think that China actually has really solid allies, as was mentioned before. I believe that it has a bunch of countries that are dependent from it financially, get gain from China for their own financial and material advantages. But I do believe that this is a very flimsy type of alliance because it actually stands on opportunistic interest and can shift at any time should better proposal come about. For example, build back a better world. It doesn't have to be that one, but I guess you see my point, right? These are not trustworthy alliances based on values. What we see is actually the global perceptions of China, especially with the combination of COVID-19, ongoing human rights abuses in Xinjiang, aggressive policies towards Hong Kong, threats in the direction of Taiwan, have resulted in massive negative opinions of China, reaching levels not seen since the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989.
Thank you, Bates. I have a question for you. You mentioned in your arguments how China is building up its military. It has the largest navy now. Its nuclear arsenal is large. The largest military spending is continuously increasing. So you say, so it's dangerous to think China is at the peak of its powers. Yet in the region and elsewhere in the world, we see new coalitions grouping together against this rising military influence from China. Also militarily, we have AUKUS, we have the Quad, we have a country like Indonesia asking for more military exercises with, for example, European or European nations or America. So how important is this military argument in saying that China might get the overhand and might keep its influence growing if the other countries are now responding to that already?
Thanks very much, Remco. I'm glad you asked that because I've been doing a lot of work on trying to understand America's relationships with partners in the Indo-Pacific region and dig deeply into the thinking within those countries about what kind of partnership they actually would like to have with the United States. I'll get to that in a second, but I just want to make one point. I mean, the point about China not having any alliances, I mean, I don't understand the validity of that claim. China rose from a backward, poor country in the 1970s to where it is today without a single real alliance. It's never had alliances. So that shouldn't be even a factor in trying to understand its future power. For that matter, there's other countries around the world that have alliances and they are declining powers. So just having alliances in and of itself does not really indicate very well what a future power might look like. And maybe the case of the United States and its partnerships in the region is a good example of that. Even our closest, some of our US closest allies like Japan and Australia, public opinion within those countries is quite fractured around matters of relationship with China, maybe in Australia greater than anywhere else. Public perceptions of China within Australia remain, while in some decline, relatively strong, even in spite of the economic punishments which China has landed against them. So to get directly to your point, Remco, I think, yes, we've seen the emergence of the Quad, for example, but still it's largely a political and diplomatic effort. I don't think we'll see the Quad evolve into anything military in any near-term future, even as China continues to build up its military power. And even in the case of AUKUS, while I think it's an excellent development, and you're absolutely right to suggest that it is in reaction to China's growing power, that's exactly my point. China's power is growing. It is creating some of these counterbalancing coalitions. And whether or not they're going to be successful in actually tamping down and forcing a decline in China's growing military strength, I think is still an open question, something we won't know for years to come. And even the very hoped for outcomes of AUKUS are things we won't know for many, many years to come, 5, 10, 15, even 20 years from now. So again, this gets back to my point. China is still rising. Yes, all these things are happening. Yes, China is facing headwinds. Yes, as Dan said, there are countervailing initiatives underway in the West, whether that's military or economic, to try to counteract that. But that's still years ahead before the outcomes of those are going to be known. In the meantime, China continues to rise. It has not peaked.
Thank you. I have a final question for Dan. Dan, the US has limited shipments to China of semiconductors used for AI, artificial intelligence, has limited the shipments of chip making tools. Twofold, how much power does the US still have to weaken China's economy and its growth there? And does this not just motivate China to develop these things domestically even faster, thus strengthening the country's position in the long term?
Yeah, well, let me say it first that in the meantime, China is not rising right now at all. For the first time in 50 years, it's having zero growth this year on net. Simona offered the optimistic estimate of as much as 2.5% growth for 2022. But in light of the current degree of protest, additional COVID lockdown, et cetera, the bottom of that range is below zero. So actually, I mean, the other side in this debate has to address that and make the argument that China can get out of the funk it's in and back on any kind of growth trajectory, because right now there's zero growth. And then it has to come back to where Bates just was, the question of whether relative to the West, it can get back to outpacing. Indeed, while many of the kind of considerations that Bates pointed to are 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, Germany, of all countries, has already gotten off the fence because of another autocracy, China's partner in Russia, and started to put hundreds of billions of new dollars into military spending. Japan has softened its inherent self-defense only principles because of China. And so these are happening right now, and they're affecting the relative balance in profound ways. The burden is on China to answer how it can get back to its potential to keep pace with that, let alone outpace it. Semiconductors is a critical demonstration of just how much latent leverage the United States and its allies still really have. Untested a few years ago, people started to accept the narrative that China's relative rise was inevitable, American decline inevitable. And yet the demonstration that Huawei, in fact, without American permissiveness, was not going to be able to meet any of its global ambitions, that without American permissiveness, China's semiconductor dreams are just that. And of course, if it could do all this, it would have done all this a long time ago. It's poured hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars into semiconductor self-reliance, only to have a series of arrested, detained semiconductor executives in Chinese jails to show for it, because they haven't gotten anywhere out of the starting gates in terms of really indigenizing near the cutting edge of where the West is going in semiconductors.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking at the time. I think, is there time for one more question? No, we have no more time, unfortunately. Maybe in the debrief for our members after this debate. Thanks very much now to all four of you. It's now time for the closing statements from both teams. Each participant will get 2 minutes to summarize their view and argue why you should vote for their position in the final poll coming up soon. The order of the closing statements is the same as at the beginning of this debate, which means we start with Simona, followed by Bates, then Dan, and finally Rorry. Simona, you have 2 minutes for your closing statement.
All right. So China's long-term demographic, economic, and environmental pressure, as we have heard, are increasing. And there is little the CCP can do to actually stimulate economic activity to rival the boom years of the past. The political climate also points to tougher market conditions going forward, with less liberalization, more centralized control, and a bigger focus on national security issues. In other words, China's future role on the global stage in the foreseeable future depends on its internal stability and on the development of its political and socioeconomic conditions. But the authoritarian nature of China's political system and lack of transparency will further damage its international image and also weaken its soft power, whereas the huge economic gap between coastal and inland provinces will contribute to increased social inequality and instability in Chinese society. And lastly, an aging population will lead to a slowdown of the Chinese economy, while the damage to natural resources suggests severe ecological and environmental problems going forward in the future. All these negative factors will hurt China's drive for modernization and also its quest to sustain rising global power. Also, the lack of transparency in its decision-making process will not be conducive to its cooperation with neighboring countries, as well as with the United States, as we have talked about before, and then mentioned Japan. And to this point, one of the biggest challenges I see going forward, and potentially, in my opinion, really also the one that could shatter completely China's relations with the West, is its attempt to extend sovereignty over Taiwan. China, like Russia in Ukraine, is stuck thinking about power in 19th century terms. But sadly, that is how they signal that they want to proceed with Taiwan. But is that what power really means in the 21st century? I think most of you listening tonight will agree with us that it is not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simona. Bates, you have 2 minutes for your closing statement.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a great discussion. I've learned a lot doing so. We've made the point that power in the international system is both relative, and of course, we have to think about it as being comprehensive. That is, a country's power needs to be placed in the context of its relationships to others. And of course, it's not a matter of economic power alone, which is where our counterparts have mostly focused their arguments. Dan asked what we have to say about 0% growth in China today. Well, of course, we know that that's not going to go on forever. And even if it meets the targets, which Simona mentioned, of just merely a 2% growth rate going forward, that's half the size of the Swiss economy every year. That's growth. Whether you want to call it that or not, that is growth. And as long as China is growing, then we have to say that it's not peaking. That's another point I'd like to add here. It's all true that these headwinds are mounting. We all understand that. But I think the peak that we're all talking about is not today. The peak that we're all talking about is probably 10 or 15 years out still, even as these headwinds begin to really take shape. So to say that China's peak now is simply analytically incorrect, and as I've suggested, may even be dangerous in thinking that that might be the case. Yes, China will peak someday, but that day is still in the future. And to think otherwise, I think, is both unwise and risky. Thank you.
Thank you, Bates. Now for the final closing statement of the team arguing in favor of the motion, we go to Dan for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. This has been terrific. I think we can all agree on that. There's no debate about that. The peak, as Bates and Rorry have noted, is relative. China, a $17 trillion economy growing at 2%, will never outpace the United States, a $26 trillion economy growing at 1.5%. Or if that passing point happened, it would be a century from now. If China and its leadership of Xi Jinping can be pragmatic, I'd vote no on the proposition today. No, China's power has not peaked. If, however, China continues with the kind of rigidity which has characterized it over the past 7 or 8 years, then I think you really have to vote yes. China's rise as a power, as we've known it and expected it, has peaked. I think you have to ask yourselves, as you get ready to vote on how we all did here today, whether you think General Secretary Xi Jinping is more likely to behave in a pragmatic manner or to continue in a more rigid manner of statecraft, and then your vote is pretty much decided. I hope you will stick where I remain to be, though I've learned a lot here as well, and vote yes, that we need to look past the notion of rising Chinese power. Because once we come to that realization, once we accept that, we have an awful lot of work to do, because there are profound consequences from that conclusion. There's less China market for us to sell to. German car companies are in deep trouble and need to adjust now, not wait another 5 years to do so. There's less Chinese ability to subsidize development in sub-Saharan Africa. If we're concerned about migrants pressured by climate coming to our shores today, we have a much bigger problem than we thought we had. And sadly, China's much less able to afford its own decarbonization, let alone help us pay for ours. The global burden is going to remain squarely on us in the advanced market democracies, and I think we need to prepare to shoulder that burden. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you. And finally, the last closing statement of the team opposing the motion today. Rorry, your 2 minutes.
Thank you. I agree with all the panelists that this has been a rich and substantive discussion. I would like to make the following points about China's rise under Xi Jinping. Under Xi Jinping, China's economy in 2021 grew 8.1%. So while it may achieve zero growth in this year, at the most pessimistic end of the scale, year-on-year growth last year was well over target. And I think will continue to be over target as China pulls away from these zero COVID policies, which are deeply unpopular. Xi Jinping's first preoccupation in his seat is keeping it and staying in power. And as the Chinese people protest for better conditions, particularly for the end of zero COVID, the Chinese government is going to be flexible and pragmatic about making sure that that happens. Number two, under Xi Jinping, China's outbound direct investment has grown. It was actually #1 in the world last year as well. It is among the top 3 economies for overseas direct investment in the world. And that position will continue to grow. So while our opponents would have you believe that Xi Jinping is incapable of using and directing China's resources to growing China's global power position, I would argue that Xi Jinping is not. That despite a rigid set of controls at home, Xi Jinping is very invested, and the Chinese government is very invested in making sure that China's global interests are well protected. Ultimately, to achieve China's goal, including being a prosperous country by mid-century, which is the premise of Communist Party control in China, China will have to be flexible, pragmatic, and invested in the global system. They will have to grow their power, and they will continue to do so. China has not peaked yet.
Thank you very much, Rorry. Exactly 2 minutes. And thank you all for this fantastic debate and your well thought out arguments. It's now time for the grand finale of this debate. And that means that you, the audience, can vote one more time on the motion, which is China's global power has reached its peak. Click yes if you agree with that. Click no if you disagree. And if you still don't know, then choose I don't know. We've been talking a lot, so let's watch how you vote in about 45 minutes of comfortable silence. All right, thank you very much for your votes. The poll is now closed. And while we wait for the results to be calculated, let me tell you about our upcoming events here at Asia Society Switzerland. First, Friday next week, December 9th, we are hosting the last iteration of this year of our Big Picture series with a dive into the world of Indian Ragamala that combines music, poetry, and painting. Sonika Soni and Vir Amar Dash Mahapatra will show you what it looks like and sounds like, and Samira Miller will moderate the evening, and that's next week, Friday, here in Zurich. 1 week later, on Friday, December 16th, we are having a virtual members get-together to look back on the year and talk about hopes and expectations for 2023 with members from Asia Society centers around the world. This event is hosted together with our friends at Asia Society Philippines, Hong Kong, and New York. More information on both events on our website, asiasociety.org/Switzerland. All right, the results are in. It's time to see which team has been most successful in attracting supporters with their arguments. We see that in the first poll, the team that agrees with the motion has gone from 22% to 29% in the second poll. The team arguing against has lost 4% from 62 to 58%. So that means that the team that argued in favor of the motion has actually won this debate with gaining 7% of the support as opposed to losing 4%. Congratulations to the winning team, but both teams, Simona, Dan, Rorry, Bates, thank you very much for your contributions. And thank you all for joining us today. If you're a member of Asia Society Switzerland, you can now join us for a separate debrief meeting with the speakers. We'll start that in a minute or two. You should have received the link, a separate link for this meeting in Zoom. Everyone else, we hope to see you again soon. If you have any feedback on this event, we appreciate it if you can fill out the form. You will see a link to that when you close this call. You can also use the feedback link in the thank you mail, which we'll send you in the next hour or so. Again, thank you all very much, and we hope to see you very soon.